This is a repeat of the Firing Line program originally telecast on December 23, 1973.
We know, of course, that Jesus is a superstar, that standing having been validated by Variety, and that there is a phenomenon called the Jesus movement. Indeed, it is occasionally recalled that there is in America and elsewhere a Christian religion in which some are passionately inscribed, with which others are lackadaisically affiliated. Every now and then, not so often as to strain the patience of reviewers, a truly literate man writes about Christianity. And most often the response is a sort of uneasy acknowledgement that the species survives. Occasionally the author is greeted with surprise of an unusual kind. So has it been for Mr. Malachi Martin, whose new book, Jesus Now, has bowled its preliminary readers over. Martin Grief of Time Incorporated says about it, once in a decade a book is published so unassailable in its logic and limitless in its depth of understanding that it converts the critical reader to a point of view different from his own. Jesus Now is such a book. Mr. Martin used to be Father Martin S.J. He left the Catholic priesthood in 1964, though not, but this I say without documentation, Catholicism. He is an American who was born in Ireland, studied theology at Louvain, Belgium, and was professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. He has 3 doctorates, has studied at Oxford and Hebrew University, is fluent in 8 languages, and was closely associated with the principal figures involved in Vatican II, including, and that is the title of his first book, 3 Popes and a Cardinal. Before his current book, Jesus Now, he wrote several others, most conspicuously The Encounter. Mr. Martin has many theses, all of which we cannot hope to canvass, but one of them is that the disrepute of Christianity is significantly related to the tendency of diverse cultures and civilizations to take Jesus and adapt him to their own uses and paradigms. As one would expect, as much as charged to Malachi Martin, i.e. that his Jesus is in a way as arbitrary as the Jesus of others, should we call them vested interests. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Martin, why are you better equipped than, say, the Pope, though not the Pope qua Pope, to interpret Jesus?
Well, of course, Mr. Buckley, that's almost an appeal for me to make an act of humility, which I'm sure neither you nor your audience need. And
It's a question whether you're capable of it.
Yeah, that's another thing. There was a famous priest in Rome, a rector of a college, and his most famous phrase was, I assure you, I'm not making it up, was, my strong point is my humility. And everybody knew that. But apart from the humility, I'll tell you, I don't feel any more capable than the Pope, or indeed than anyone, to provide a perfect analysis or a better analysis of Jesus. And I have tried to avoid, in that book, forming another Jesus figure. So I'm not any more capable, but at least I've done this. I've spent a good long time gathering information on the figures, the garbs with which Jesus, that man, and as I believe God, has been clothed. And if somebody does a better job, hallelujah, or cheers, I would be very happy.
Well, I think I didn't intend to impute any arrogance to you,
yes.
Although it's, I think it is true that there is an odd convergence of true humility and true arrogance.
I think so.
And,
I think so.
But what I was attempting to probe is the question whether the malleability of Jesus, as you demonstrate it in your book, is a malleability which you yourself have opportunized on.
Yes.
But first of all, to show us how it's done,
Yes.
would you mind explaining to us the sentence in which you say Christianity became synonymous and practically coterminous with white culture and
Yes.
Western civilization, so that we can understand, if you tell us how that happened, how it
Yes.
could also happen that other people could co-opt him?
Could cooperate, yes. Well, you see, the few historical facts we know about Jesus as a man who lived in time and space tell us that he was born in 7 BC, roughly, which sounds funny, but it's like that. And he was crucified, killed by...
He could have changed that if he wanted to.
Yes, he could have. But there was a little monk called Dennis the Exiguous in the 6th century AD who decided that it was going to be 180. All right. And we know that he was crucified by a Roman execution between the year 28 and 36 AD. That's for sure. We know for certain his mother was Mary. About anything else, we know very little. We know he was brown-skinned, because all Palestinian Jews at that time were, unless he was a complete genetic mutant. Brown-skinned, yes. Something like the Egyptians today in the Upper Nile would be. Now, and he spoke Aramaic, and his concepts were Semitic. He probably knew some Latin and Greek. He knew very little else as a man. What he knew as a man who happened to be God, or who was God, not by happenstance, is something else, but taking the human form of it. Well, he dies, and he appears again, and then he disappears, becomes invisible. His followers go abroad, by necessity, really. Palestine got very hot for them. So some of the major ones gather in Rome, and it's Latin, it's Roman, and it's the beginning of the Roman Commonwealth at that time, about the end of the 1st century, when the idea of the Mediterranean Commonwealth and the Roman man was emerging as being man. And it was a fusion of the old Greek ideal put into the solidity of Rome, law and architecture aligned to the Greek idea of beauty. That man was capable of perfection, was capable at least. 400 years later, we find the Bishop of Rome, the Episcopos, as they called him, wearing the sandals of Caesar with the blessing of Constantine, who went over to the Bosphorus. Well, then, of course, we find that Jesus has already got a Roman face in the icons. And his words are in Latin. 3 centuries later, Leo III runs off to Paderborn because his taxpayers are in revolt. He's a pope. And he kisses the toe of a man called Karl, who we know as Charlemagne. And the deal was very simple. Put me back. Give me back my papal states, and I will make you emperor of the West. And Jesus will be co-emperor with you. So Jesus Caesar emerged about that time, and he was white and Western. And then Christianity took over Western Europe completely, and by the 15th century, Jesus was considered to be white, Western, speaking Latin, and thinking in Western philosophy. So it became coterminous, and everywhere they went, whether it was South America or India or Straits of Malacca or Africa, the Jesus they brought and the description of Jesus' thoughts and his will and the means of living the life of Jesus, called grace, the sacraments, were all couched in the words and concepts developed in the West between 5 and 1300. So that made Jesus coterminous and identical with...
How do you account for the fact that the alleged exact replica of Jesus' mother, which is venerated in Mexico, is of a lady very nearly black, or for that matter, in Montserrat?
That's right.
The equivalent in Spain.
That's right.
Are you saying something that simply goes beyond the fact that people tend to fantasize those whom they worship to have similar racial characteristics?
Yes.
You are going beyond that.
I'm on that, yes. I would say that they do tend to fantasize them into that position. And there is a black virgin in Dublin, Ireland, you know, as well as, and there's a black virgin in the Belgian Congo, now there.
These are admissions against interest. You started to say that by the 15th century,
yes,
the Jesus that was exported by the missionaries
yes.
was a distinctively Western white Jesus. I'm
yes.
asking you,
yes.
how is it under the circumstances that Jesus' mother, as venerated in Mexico City, is not white, but very Indian?
That would be, in this optic, a local variation, but certainly none of the missionaries would say, and the official church wouldn't say she was, as she is portrayed in Mexico, black, nor Jesus.
Well, I've never heard any pronouncements on the subject, but I have certainly never, any resentment by Spanish bishops was highly palpable during the 16th and 17th centuries and part of the 18th centuries when they were totally dominant in this hemisphere. But I have never read about any resistance to the acculturation.
No, you're right, there wasn't. And in South America, the acculturation went much further.
Why? How come?
Because South America, somehow or other, it assumed Christians into the articulation of the land. And as in Ireland, a lot of the superstitions and legends prior to Christianity were taken over by Christianity and channeled for its use.
Baptized.
Yes, and for popular use only. Officially, the church always made a distinction, and while they will allow the head of a cocker spaniel to be nailed to the cross on the feast of Easter, in the villages, they will not do it in the cathedral, nor will it be consecrated in the theology books.
Well, what I'm trying
so
to
it's the official church on the one hand, and then popular devotion. And we both know that popular devotion in the church has been allowed to have its excesses.
Well, what I'm trying to understand is this. We are familiar with the charge that Christianity is substantially discredited in virtue of its having served as the rubric within the protection of which much that we know of as Western imperialism went forward.
Yes.
But you and I and others also know that it is a common reaction to resent those gods which are the gods of one's oppressor. What I do not know, and I do not find clear in your book, is wherein was the effort made to engraft into historical Jesus a series of attitudes which are distinctive to Western folkways, mores.
Well,
did they go around saying that Jesus was a capitalist? Or
no,
did they
but
go
they did present Jesus as a Western monk at times, and they presented him as a Western theologian and philosopher, and they presented him as
But
a
this
Western...
was a time-place situation rather than something that got into his philosophy, right? Or
yes, although it was, if after all the bishop who comes to convert me and the pope he talks about are presented in an imperial stance, and they represented Jesus. When they speak, it is Jesus speaking, and that is the way it was presented. And the bishop represents Jesus, and the priest, this pastor who is white, and before whom you must kneel, his words are the words of Jesus. This is the constant theme of missionaries. I represent Jesus, and my bishop too, and the Pope. And the stance of all these peoples is a white Western one, necessarily, and not necessarily bad. Then I identified that necessarily with Jesus, if I'm a believing, accepting acolyte.
But was it not accepted that even then that Jesus spoke in broad categories, so that when he said render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, he was referring to a genus rather than to a person? He didn't say render to Ferdinand and Isabella.
No, he said render. It was a genus. It was a genus, yes.
Now, under the circumstances, in what sense was it prejudicial to the plausibility of the missionaries' message that the people who brought them that message in fact introduced into their lives a Jesus who, as a matter of fact, remains in Latin America as a symbol of, as a being of considerable force, 150 years after they kicked out the Spaniards?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, I don't think it did all that amount of damage at that time. I think the difficulty is that today, when the system which gave birth to those figures no longer has the same financial, political, economic predominance. Power is a difficult word to use. And when a different form of socio-political outlook is taking over these countries, as in South America, what do you find, Mr. Buckley? You find that on the one hand you have the superstructure of the hierarchy, cardinals, bishops, and the ordinary good parish priest, and then you have a crowd of, you have a whole set of parish priests, Dominicans, Jesuits, who not only differ with the bishops, and I'm not criticizing them in describing them, but they shoulder guns, and they fight with the rebels in Guatemala. And they're up in arms against what the Brazilian government is doing to the dissatisfied members of the... And they say, no, Jesus is not like that. And some of them will even use Mao Zedong's phrase, revolution comes out of the muzzle of a gun. So, but in between them stands the figure of Jesus, one of them saying he represents us, law and order, the government, the hierarchy. The other saying, no, he doesn't. Well, so the ancient figure and the new figure is presented, both falsifications.
But what I'm asking, though, has there been a substantial historical mutilation of Jesus? It is true that among Jesus's primary exegetes were people who put a high value on the law,
yes,
and that Jesus himself did,
yes,
and that under the circumstances, those who say that the law should be obeyed can, in fact, without corrupting
yes,
the provenance of this commandment, find some sort of biblical sanction,
yes,
can't they?
Yes, they can.
But as I understand you to have drawn conclusions about Jesus that suggest that there has been a very narrow parochial co-option, or is it co-optation?
I think it's co-option, it's just as good anyway.
Of him.
Yes, I think so. But again, I think, Mr. Buckley, it's really in the stretch of history. At that time, no. I think if I may use an analogy with you, like when I was a child, my mother would tell me, and the parish priest would tell me, that Jesus, when he was young, didn't do that sort of thing. He didn't steal apples, he didn't beat his sister, he didn't tell lies. And they didn't know what Jesus did. They were quite right, he didn't commit sins, we know from theology. But they went even further in their analogies, and it suited me. And many a sermon I heard, for instance, this is only an analogy now,
yeah,
a sermon I heard about the Sacred Heart, that devotion to Jesus, to his Sacred Heart. Now, I know, would mean very little to me because it came out of a very local area with somebody who had invested this affective figure, a very valuable figure of Jesus, by the way, this affective figure of Jesus with his own emotions and the emotions that would draw out my virtue, so far as I practice virtue. Now, that's an analogy, I think, for what happened. When I grew up...
The myotic Jesus.
The myotic Jesus, right. And, when I was a child, the things of when I was a child. When I grew up, as Paul said, something else. And I think there is another dimension added to nations today. And somehow or other, the figure of Jesus presented, and the figures presented, don't meet that dimension. And that at one time Jesus as a monk presented to people when monks were the educators and the source of stability, even agricultural stability in places like France. Very good.
Yeah.
But today, to present him in various guises, especially in the guises chosen by certain Christian churches, doesn't fit. There is another dimension. Now, you spoke about mutilations a moment ago. There are Jesus figures which are mutilations. And, of course, if they're mutilations, then they don't even agree with
They're profane.
Well, they don't, I mean, if I say Jesus has...
What would be an example?
Jesus Black.
Yeah.
Or Jesus the Mystic Gun. Or Jesus
Or
Yogi.
Jesus White.
Or Jesus Femina.
Yeah.
Or Jesus Gay. I mean, those seem to be gross mutilations of historical fact. A lot of them, or Mary Baker Eddy's Jesus. No resemblance whatever. Or the Mormon Jesus. And if I'm a Mormon, if it helps me, fine. If I can tickle the belly of an alligator and it helps me, do it if you find a complacent alligator. But don't let me say I am kissing my beloved. And similarly with the Mormon Jesus. So there are mutilations and deformations, provided they're not put forward for everybody and as a solution for the world, and they normally are, they're all right. But there is another dimension abroad, and I'm more concerned with the larger conglomerates. My own church, the Roman Catholic Church, in which I was born, in which I will die, the Greek and Russian Orthodox, the Anglican, the Episcopalian insofar as it's holding together, because it's rather disintegrating. After all, when the Bishop of New York can say that you needn't believe in God and be a good Episcopalian bishop, that is something, you know. But, and so on and so forth. And they still officially present figure of Jesus, which really don't hit the need that people have, and don't, I think, and here you have me spiked really, don't, because it's a personal opinion, don't meet what Jesus, in my humble opinion, what Jesus is effecting
in your humble and unmistakable.
But my strong point is humility, to quote a greater man.
Well,
yes.
But you make a strong point in your book,
yes,
that the deterioration of Christianity,
yes,
in the last 50 years,
yes,
is something without historical parallel. And
yes,
in fact, you say that it is only people of your age, of our age and older,
yes,
who will ever have known the difference between the way it was and the way it now is,
yes,
and that people of the age of most of the people in this room will never know it the way it was. I ask you two questions.
yes.
First of all, the more difficult one,
Yes.
to be followed by the question, how do you know? But the first question I want to ask is, what were the distinctive historical and cultural impulses of the present age that should have done to Christianity that which was not done to it under really rather extraordinary and irresistible impulses in other ages?
Mm-hmm.
I heard it said by a rabbi a few years ago that he ceased to believe in God because of Dachau. And for all of the distinctive horror of Dachau, it seems to me that there are historical antecedents,
Sure,
which must have seemed as shocking then as Dachau seems now.
Sure.
I'm asking you, what is it that all of a sudden
yes,
precipitated a flight from Christianity?
yes. Look, would it be too parochial of me if I talked about the Catholic Church as an example?
Not at all, not at all.
I could parallel it, but I don't want to sort of.
No.
Well, I'll tell you, when I was young, now being full of humility and over 80, but when I was young, the church in which I was reared, I could describe it graphically and simply as this. We were the people, all right?
Like James Joyce.
That's right. And we lived, it was muscular Christianity. And the parish was the focal point, the hearth, all right? The parish priest was there. And he had some sort of, you know, normal infallibility, whatever that means. And then we had the bishop, and the people obeyed the priests, and the priests obeyed the bishop. And the bishop then was under a man called the cardinal, or the primate, and he was in constant communication with him. So the paradigm ran, and they obeyed the cardinal, the primate, and he was in strict communication with the other cardinals who were under the pope. And an invisible cement linked priests, people and priests amongst themselves and their various archdeacons and parish priests and assistants, to the bishops, and the bishops under their cardinal, and the cardinals together, and the cardinals, the ministries in Rome, in the Vatican, which was, after all, the seat of Jesus, in this optic, and there was the Pope, the successor of Peter, and the vicar, the representative of Jesus.
A pretty stable social schematic.
Oh yes, it had vast socio-political implications. Now, I find in 1973, end of 1973, that cement to at least under a statistical analysis, and I know lies, damn lies in statistics, for fear you might quote it at me, but under statistical analysis, that cement is gone. And how, well, if you take vital points.
But truly not more than, say, 800 years ago when there were two contending popes.
Well, under 800 years ago when there were two contending popes, the practice of both the contenders was very, very strict. They were both contending, they both claimed they loved God more, and they were both contending to be more strict. But today, for instance, the basic things on which the church has gone on record through the Pope, contraception, 88%, Roman figure given, divorce, 64%. This is worldwide on an average statistic.
64% means what? 64%?
64% divorce.
Of what?
Of Catholics, Roman Catholics. Divorce. Abortion.
That figure surprises me.
Yes.
Are you certain of it?
Well, I haven't got the documentation here, but I will give it to you.
I didn't expect you to bring it.
No, it's very high. Abortion, where it's allowed, Roman Catholics take it. Homosexuality, the attitude to homosexuality, both amongst priests and people, has changed completely from what it was, certainly when I was young. Open-ended marriages, as they call them, are becoming more and more or less looked upon. Premarital sex is looked upon as something vastly more acceptable than sex, as they call it. I dislike the word because I think it's so truncated. Sex with a married person, what is called theologically adultery. But premarital sex with somebody who's not married is considered to be vastly more acceptable, which is a huge step for Catholics to take. And if I've read some of the reports the bishops of Latin America have turned in, and the archbishops and the English bishops, and on this point in their confidential reports, that is sent to Rome, not published, the statistics are horrendous. Then the reception of communion, the number of confessions, the number of people who do it regularly, the number of the baptized in a place like France or Italy. There are whole areas in France in which there is no one baptized at all. Now, this, and then even amongst those who are baptized and who are reared in the church and who have children who are baptized and, go to Mass now and then, and perhaps they skimp on confessions and Holy Communion, but the normal good Catholic. There is no longer, except the very conservatives, and they're in a minority, as far as I can discern statistically, the cement, the immediate obeisance to the priest, and of the priest to the bishops, and the bishops to the Pope. I don't find it.
Well, when you consider that there were scandals of such extraordinary proportion hundreds of years ago, you had adulterous popes, and
yes,
illegitimate children of bishops and all that kind of stuff.
Bill, I have known.
And you had the contumely by the emperors whose titles were supposedly held at the sufferance of the Pope, and you had massive defections, you had excommunications of the University of Paris and so on. What makes you think that the statistics, however luridly they can be recited, prescind
because there was
this
never,
age?
yes.
Or are you saying that which flowed into this age is something far more resonant and venomous than that which flowed into any other age?
Well, whether it's venomous or not is another thing. I hesitate to call it venomous. Something else has flown in. There is an independence today in that structure. It's in the Anglican Church more than it is in the Catholic Church. It's in the Greek Orthodox Church more than the Anglican Church, both in Greece and above all abroad. There are only 14, 15 million, all Greek Orthodox, but the cement is non-existent. There is this lack of some vital essence of authority that once I would revolt, but I was in revolt. Now they consider themselves to be near Jesus, as near to the priest, but don't speak to me. I know what to do. They're not in revolt at all, and they're not indifferent. They want a church, and they want laws, but they question everything and authority. It's not a revolt or dissidence or fighting, no. And they don't want a new church. And they love Jesus. They're good people. But somehow or other, an inner dimension has changed. And this, if I could go one step further before we go on, you asked me, how do I know? Of course, I haven't got a crystal ball, and I'm not a prophet in spite of my name, which means my angel, or what is the name of a prophet. But I can only satisfy my intellect, Mr. Buckley. I can only give a ratio sufficiens, a sufficient reason, by saying, if I presume that Jesus has decided that he who was the author of the cement, he gave the priest the unction, he gave the bishops the power and the unction, he gave the Pope the authority. And I'm not talking about the ipse dixit, or you do this, tell them this, but the power in spirit, so that when he spoke, the Holy Spirit touched my heart and I obeyed. If I presume Jesus is the author of that, And all of a sudden, within 25 years, to give it a cliche date which I know can be attacked, but say between 1945 and 1973, I find that mystic essence, that metaphysical, more than metaphysical cement, has evaporated. I must presuppose the author has withdrawn it.
Not that the human species has become stone-hearted?
Oh, no, no, no. I think we have millions of much better people than ever today. And there is born a new thing in the hearts of people. There is, I think, under the pressure of life today and the intercommunication and the action of Jesus, who works with compassion. I do sound like a Bible preacher, but really I believe this. There is born a new interest in the self, in what I am. And if you look at, for instance, as indications of that, if you look at the books that really are bought, I'm okay, you're okay. How to Be Your Own Best Friend or Psychologist, The Primal Scream, even Jonathan Livingston Seagull. What's the central essence? You, yourself. You can fly.
Shouldn't this new species be especially nubile to Christian impregnation?
Yes, but I was going to say unfortunately, as it happens, they will not accept the Jesus figures which before were presented and accepted.
Well, but you just said, I thought we agreed that they had not been so mutilated as to distract from their integrity.
I know, and I agree, but they won't accept them anyway.
Why? Invincible ignorance?
No, I think that because they were created by a structure, the church, and I admire that structure. I'm not condemning it, I'm not saying the structure like as if it's a bad thing. They were created by a structure which was originally supposed to cater uniquely for spirit, which didn't, and the author of that structure, Jesus, is liquidating that structure, not wiping it out, he's transforming it. In the hearts of people today is born a new thing, and it won't accept those figures that incarnated the attitudes of the old. I think it's the action of Jesus.
To what extent should Christian loyalty attach to the structure?
As long as that structure is viable. In other words, you ask me a very basic question: what does a good Catholic or a good Christian do? Do you say to the Pope and the bishops, go away, you no longer belong to Jesus? No, I don't think so. You have your conscience, first of all. But there is also the necessity to work for helping that structure to change and to adapt. Instead of battering the Pope, say, because he says there is no contraception, start working to find out what is the basic issue of contraception and abortion too. When abortion is forbidden, instead of rising up in arms and say, well, we should be allowed abortion at least for rape cases or at least for mongoloid or defective babies or something, let's try and see, can we do something about that entire affair within the church and help to transform it, always saying our prayers and receiving the sacraments, because we have no means of grace or direction from Jesus unless we get his grace. I'm speaking very parochially as a Catholic.
Well, you're also speaking very transcendently. If you don't mind my asking,
yes.
Don't mind my asking you something, even though it involves me slightly.
Yes.
I saw this morning a statement that you made 2 years ago on the Today Show.
Yes.
In which you were remarking that people no longer appeal to that which is right as distinguished from that which is wrong. When they plead a case, they appeal to the constitutionality of this.
Right. Right.
And you said, if you take the TV personalities, for instance, take somebody like William Buckley. Now, you said William Buckley is about the only one who appears to approach his subjects with ethical principles or presuppositions. And yet, if you examine it carefully, he tackles his subject with ethical glove and a mental rapier, yet that glove is spiked with barbs of cynicism, and the rapier means love. So even that is merely a semblance of an ethical approach. I don't understand what you meant to say when you said the rapier means love.
Because since it is a personal thing, let
Yeah.
me make a personal
Sure.
comment. I have always felt that even when the rapier of your mind, and I think it's the best description of it because it's brilliant, in my opinion, when it goes right home, your intent is love.
Well, why is that anti-ethical?
As far as I remember the context, I was making a distinction between acting, it's not anti-ethical, acting purely out of ethics, which I think kills, and having your action vivified by love. It makes a distinction.
Well, is it your feeling that we have so far lost basic ethical presuppositions that, for instance, when we see, say, Richard Nixon say something, we question whether he uses the truth or doesn't use the truth, merely with reference to whether the truth serves him or doesn't serve him, without any assumption, any general public assumption, that he would use the truth because it is the truth?
We assume that, I think, yes. I think so. And also behind my mind, there is this feeling that today, for us, guilt has become largely legal, and truth is something...
Because the divine sanction is gone.
Yes, or because simply we have had it dinned into us by people that we live by a rule of law, and without law we have nothing, and which is true. We have very little without law, but we just can't exist by the law, and by simply ethic as such. This is good, this is bad, because finally I know when my passion comes for gold, for woman, for power, I will say, why isn't it good? And the only answer will be, because there is a God who says so, and who...
Whose authority you accept?
But the sheer ethic by itself, no. By itself, without love, without this thrust of love, even though it hurts. Perhaps that's why Pascal said, Il n'y a que la vérité et l'amour qui blesse. Only truth and love hurt.
Oh, I didn't know love was in there.
Yes, in the original quotation. Somebody cut it down to Il n'y a que la vérité qui blesse. And he must have been strictly somebody who liked ethic, as distinct from love.
Before turning to the panel, can I ask you just one quick concrete question? There's been a lot of news.
Yes.
It's been in the newspapers for the last few days about this scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin.
Yes.
My question to you is, what, if anything, of a theological nature could be proved if it was established that that was in fact Christ's shroud?
Well, of a theological nature, the only thing that could be proved would be things which help theology, like, as you know, the man's hands were crossed over his crotch like that. And the blood on each hand coming out falls at a certain angle. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but mathematicians have calculated that the direction from the wound on this part of the hand...
Which, by the way, was here.
That's right, in the wrist.
Yeah.
That's right. When they project the hand up, it falls. Then they measure the angles, and they can get the height of the cross or something out of it. And it's just a historical facts aiding identification. There's nothing which changes theology except that it does bolster the historical facts that make theology possible, if it were proven to be his shroud.
Well, is that, I'm asking you now as a scholar, is that in substantial dispute? Obviously the resurrection is, but
Yes.
is the crucifixion in substantial dispute?
Yes, there are people who would say that he wasn't crucified at all, that that was a part of a story added on because the Messiah had to die. So if it was proven to be the shroud of Jesus, it certainly is the shroud of a man who died through crucifixion.
Well, but if it's proved to be the shroud of a man who died through crucifixion, it would not therefore be proved to be the shroud of Jesus.
No, no.
What is it about it that could conceivably be miraculous?
Well, they don't know
negative image?
They don't know yet how you produce a negative image with what is blood, because they have tested it, and it is blood. And how do you produce a negative image? Now, if that's a miracle, it will help popular devotion, Mr. Buckley, I think. But it won't either change or affect theology very deeply.
It won't bring Brand Blanchard to his knees.
Oh, Blanchard will find some other reason. He didn't bring the French Academy to his knees in the 1890s, and I think Brand and his brother Paul can find adequate reason for dissenting.
Ms. Ronnie Stewart is a graduate assistant to the History Department of the University of Miami. Ms. Stewart,
Stewart?
Yes, I've been thinking about how the early church fathers, in order to propagate the Christian religion, had people not proving religion by reason as much as by saying, well, you just have to take that leap of faith. And of course that would continue with St. Thomas Aquinas. And I think that's the problem today, right now, is that people want more concrete proof. And you seem to strongly believe in your faith, and when you're saying Jesus now,
Yes.
why?
Well, I'll tell you, if I could disagree with you humbly, I think people don't want proof today. When you sit down with them, and after you get over the trivia, and above all when they find out that you haven't got an axe to grind and you're not trying to make them either a Catholic or a Shaker or a Holy Roller or something, you're not sectarian, you know what it always boils down to? They want to feel their inner self. And I mean that not psychologically, it's not psychic gears. It's the ineffable part of us that we recognize only momentarily. And they want to talk about that, and they want to find a meaning for it. And if you say, well, if you were to say, which in the context would be blasphemous almost humanly, they would feel it. Well, let me give you a reason for it. They'd sit back and say, oh no, this is a much more fundamental thing. And
But don't you feel that in order to get to that feeling of faith, you have to attack the mind first? I mean, since we're all almost brought up all through school and that
it's a very good thing to have good reasons. And if you have somebody like Blanchard or Paul Blanchard, a good adversary, fight with a man like that, and to thrash him intellectually is marvelous. He's asking for it, and he will do it to you if you don't do it to him. And there's only the mental noses are blooded. And if somebody really wants to fight on that arena, good. But if it's not a question of fighting, but finding out, why have I this yearning? And my children, what am I to say to them about goodness? What's bad mean? And why shouldn't I be unfaithful to my wife now and then? It won't hurt her, and besides, she's very broad-minded. You know, and what's purity? And, why must I really believe America with a patriotic thing called patriotism? Why can't I just say, well, if I have to fight the government and everything, I'll fight? What is that part of me which transcends anything which is measurable, which no psychologist can claim because they're in the dimensional and the measurable? What part of me? That question, dear, nobody uses their reason at all. They put their hand to it beneath the face of God.
Well, even by naming it, aren't you measuring it? I mean, why does it have to come down to an answer that it is God?
Well, that's a very, very big problem. And of course, we all use a myth. You know, even when I say to somebody, "I love you," I'm using myth. And without myth, we would use computer language. I have a readout. But I'm human. As Tertullian said, everything human is not alien to me, or nothing human is alien to me. And what's wrong with myth? Provided I don't believe in myth, which destroys human life or obfuscates the face of God. I love myth, and by the way, so do you, and so do we all. Otherwise, you wouldn't be dressed as you are, for instance.
Professor,
I don't understand that part.
Professor James, that's one of the mysteries of the church. Professor James Hutchinson of the Department of Philosophy and Religion at the Florida International University. Mr. Hutchinson.
Well, to follow up on that same question then,
Yes.
what is the relationship of the within or the inner feeling that's beyond measure and beyond quantification,
Yes.
to the outside world, which is basically secular? How can they be gotten together?
Well, I'll tell you. I think that's a whole Megillah. But if I could put it very briefly, Doctor, I would say this to you. And again, it may sound parochial, but it's the only answer I have coming to me. I believe that Jesus, being in time and space once, and having put off time and space, has affected both matter and spirit, the two components of our human universe. Matter and spirit, and that matter is inherently affected by that, and that far from matter being evil or negative even, that it is an ingredient of a human universe which is now, in view of Jesus, only human because more than human, and therefore that matter itself has its holiness. I don't see any need to, Now, that men's will come in and I get a bit of matter and I make a sword and I stick you with it, or I make little bits of paper and I cheat you out of your money. That's a divagation of the function of matter. But matter itself is not unholy. It would be Manichaeanism if I said otherwise. I don't know if that goes to the point.
But that is, the fact that matter has value in itself then is not substantial enough for you. Does not carry you far enough.
Matter?
Into claiming, or matter, or the secular world, outside the mind, outside the inner self.
Yes.
That is not enough then to attempt to live in the world without the affirmation of a Jesus self or of the
If
Jesus man.
I can never be human, and no action of mine of eating, drinking, washing myself, even going to the bathroom, if I can go to that level of human activity, it will never be human unless I respond. After all, if somebody comes to me and say, look, Malachi, I love you, I say, yeah. If there's no response, there's nothing born. And if food for me is something to put it in, if I don't con-celebrate, at least with the spirit while I eat, if I don't humanize it, I must respond. The difference between us, I think, and what we call lower animals, is that we respond, and our response is human. And I think in a baby that you see toddling around a corner with his father's hat on it and endeavoring to stand up from teetering, just before you laugh, and not at it, but with it, it's a cosmic joke at that moment, you experience your response to that as a human expression. You respond. And if somebody doesn't respond, you know that either humanly they're affected or evil has got at them.
You mean unaffected?
Unaffected, yes. Something is wrong. There must be a human response. I must respond. Somebody can try and evoke me, but I must respond. If I do respond to it, I think I humanize it immediately. I think, Doctor.
Miss Judith Antonarella is a graduate assistant in philosophy and religion, also at Florida International University.
Thank you. To pick up on the line of thinking about human response, I hear very strong echoes from you, Dr. Martin, of Rudolf Schnackenberg, when he defines revelation as the personal encounter of man with God.
Yes.
And that this is, in fact, brought about by God's action rather than by the action of organized religion teaching doctrine.
Yes.
It is God who calls, and it is man who
Yes.
responds. It is not so much a matter of the church teaching
Yes.
and my giving the
Yes.
proper answer from the catechism.
Yes.
Schnackenberg says that man must respond. What response do you feel is available to man? I'm thinking in terms of the church saying the response is liturgy. You mentioned concelebration.
Yes.
What response is available to me as the individual human?
Within the church or without the church?
Well, both. Within the
Both.
church, the way it is today, I feel it's very limited. Particularly for women, I may go to the communion rail, but not beyond.
No, apropos of your last remark, just on a parenthesis or a footnote, one of the big deficiencies in Christianity is there is no theology of woman at all. Although the one thing Jesus needed, having decided to become human, the only thing he needed was a woman. And logically, all priests should have been female, but male chauvinist got in the way. And as some theologians said, that, and this is a sideline, but let me finish it, as you know, it's theologically possible for God to have become a cow if he decided. He could be incarnated in a cow. But even if he had been incarnated in a cow, we men would have taken over. That's the extent. But we have no theology of woman and no theology of love, really human love, because it involves the essence of woman, and I don't think we know that theologically. But to get back to your main remark, you've touched on a very big question, because you've touched on the idea of church and the idea of the individual within the church. Look, a few things are certain, dear. One is certain that Jesus left a visible presence behind him. All the evidence
Which is the church?
Well, you see, let me not be parochial or cavil about it. I believe that at least my church, the Roman Catholic Church, is a large part of the Church of Jesus, of its visibility. Because I cannot say that about I don't know how many billion, or million at least, Russian Orthodox died outside the church. My Jesus would not be provident if that happened. But I know that my church is an essential part of the church, and that the Pope is his representative. Now, but he left a visible presence, and therefore I can't say airy-fairy, oh, well, you see, I and Jesus, we will have our colloquy, and he will tell me what to do. No. On the other hand, there is this peculiar phenomenon or happening today that something seems to have drained away from the liturgy. And personally, I find the liturgy most uninspiring, especially since I saw them composing it in Rome, and I saw young men from Washington and from Warsaw and from Dublin sitting around a table saying, well, you know, what should we make the people do now? Or we'll make them stand up at this point. That's not a living liturgy. But it's what we have, you know, what we thought we have, we've got to make do. And we're hopping up and down like marionettes at Mass and being distracted when you want to pray.
Well, you've suggested that what we should do now with regard to the church is change the structure. In the Roman Catholic Church particularly, there's absolutely no means of input from my point of view for changing that structure.
No, dear, if I said that, I really will. Well, it was an excessive language. No, Jesus is going to change the structure. Don't bother. He's the man. He'll do it all. It's like a tree which bore fruit once and it's dry, and he says, well, I'll break it over my knee and plant a new one. And you and I will be playing harps before that happens. And we haven't got to go around saying the priests are bad, the Pope is bad, the structure is wrong. No, got to do our best, carry on, because I have my individual conscience to follow. And the church still has things that I can't get otherwise. Grace, I can get forgiveness of my sins, I can get advice, I can get example. But I know, my conviction is that he is changing that thing, and they will look back in 300 years' time and say, good, holy, jumping Moses. Those people actually believed in that sort of thing then.
But where is Jesus? I hear you saying that I've got to stick with the church. Now, is he in the institution or is he in the individual?
Well, you know, don't think I'm being light-hearted or light-headed by saying to you, he is nowhere.
The balance of the paradox is to come, I take it.
That's right. That's right. The balance is to come. Because if he was anywhere, to be someplace is to be measured dimensionally, all right? You're in that chair. And this room is here in Miami. Miami is in America. Coordinates cross. You are somewhere. And therefore you are material. The essence of spirit is that it is not measured dimensionally for a very simple reason. It has no dimensions. But that does not mean that it hasn't got presence. Now, I know you can push me on presence because it's drawn from the dimensional world. We haven't got a word for it. In fact, strictly speaking, it is inaccurate to say your soul is in your body.
I would never say that.
Aha. Oh, well, that's an advance. Or I don't know. So that Jesus is, where is Jesus, is a question that I can't answer within that framework of language, but I can say this much, that Jesus being outside time and space is with all those in time and space, but he is not measured dimensionally to time and space. But we want to get into a very philosophical language because, you know, our culture has only given us philosophical language to speak about it. And that is my difficulty.
Miss Stewart.
Yeah, but I think you've avoided the question of how you're supposed to get to people to help them with this basic sense of loss that I think, at least dealing with my students in particular, I notice.
I know. Every one of them is a theater of longing.
Yeah.
They long for the light, and they long for guidance, and they long for some clear thing. Each one is a theater of longing. Now, what do you say to them? Well, it will always be highly individualized, and they will have to seek in their inner selves what Jesus is telling them. Again, it sounds as if I was in the Bible Belt, but
well, only because he keeps specifying
that
the name Jesus, whereas perhaps Nietzsche would have said this is a chaotic universe and the individual has to find his own meaning without using the term God.
Yes, well, you see, Nietzsche forgot, and now he knows he's dead and he has the light, presumably up or down, or, you know, out somewhere, and God has forgiven his madness and those pathologies he developed from those around him. So perhaps Nietzsche is adoring God. But
I can't believe you forgave your sister, though. Yeah.
No, I agree with you there. There's a problem there even for Jesus. But once you say it's a chaotic universe, the reality is that it's not. And the reality is that love and compassion moves everything in this universe because it was made by Jesus and is controlled by him. Now, and this universe therefore makes a Nietzsche possible. You know, the system always makes the rebel possible. Now, what you tell individual students is something else. It's a long thing, but you know, another difficulty you and I have, and I'm sure Mr. Buckley has, we all have it, is that when we say Jesus, we still have an acculturated view of Jesus. And whether Jesus is creating a new vision in people's hearts today, and whether he is creating a new thing, a new appreciation of him in the spirit, as distinct from what sufficed up to now, I don't know.
Do you mind if I ask you one question I've always thought about?
What is the question?
Okay, as soon as we started realizing this was an expanding universe
Yes.
and there were many planets,
Yes.
would that mean that every planet had its own Christ that went through death
No,
and
it wouldn't.
resurrection?
No.
Did he jump around from planet to
No,
planet?
that's purely anthropomorphic, you know. And you know what it comes from? It comes from the fact that the early Christians and many Christians today, I almost got mugged in Greensboro over this. They believed that Jesus sort of came down here and then he said, now boys, you go right ahead and carry on and I'm going away. And he jumped into a spaceship and whoosh, he went up, you know, and but he's coming back. Ha-ha, you'll see that spaceship coming and 4 horsemen with it and just prepare, hallelujah, he's coming. It's so anthropomorphic and it's a Jewish and Iranian myth. Now, of course, if Jesus went away, he could never come back because he'd be mortal and dimensional. So there can't be many Jesus, there is only one individual, you know. Now that his love would extend to other planets and to those in it, and that they would need salvation, we don't know. We are earthbound. First of all, we must find out, is there anybody there in the solar system? Present moment, Pioneer is flying out with this little brown plaque and a naked man and woman on it, you know, telling them where we are, which is pathetic, really. It's pathetic. But no, I don't think there's anything to do with Jesus at all, dear. Anyway, he knows already. He's not telling us, though. And I'm not saying that jocosely. He's not telling us.
Do you find that the whole concept of the expanding planet is one of the great natural obstacles to religious devotion?
I do in this sense, Bill. I find it an obstacle because it is part of the whole evolutionary myth. And while everybody speaks about the evolution of man, they still have to find just what went from what to what. And the idea, as you find in a normal writer like Warren Weaver or Harlow Shapley, Harlow Shapley says, quotes Job as saying to God, God says to Job, where were you when I was laying the foundation of the world? And Harlow Shapley comes in and says, Job was present, his atoms were present. You know, that idea that we were all atoms once in helium and hydrogen, but that's another myth which we can't deal with today.
Thank you, Malachi Martin. I'm very grateful to you for this discussion of your book.
Thank you very much. I'm very
Thank you,
grateful
ladies and
to be here.
gentlemen. Thank you, members of the panel.
Next week, Mr. Buckley visits Johannesburg for an exchange of ideas with John Vorster, Prime Minister of the Republic of South Africa.
For a printed bound copy of this program, send 25 cents in coin to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 25 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. This program was made possible by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.